All right, I want to talk about how Hollywood is pushing people toward anime and foreign media in general. And I'm trying to be more positive, so I want to talk about essentially shit that I like about anime that Hollywood is just not doing right now, at least in the mainstream. I'll try not to spoil anything that I use for reference, but if I mention it in a category, there's a possibility that something is implied from the reference, so I'll try to keep it vague. Pretty much, I'm going to be comparing anime to Western media and kind of what pushed me personally toward anime in the first place. I'll go ahead and say I didn't see any anime, unless you want to include Pokemon, until I was in my mid 20s. So I've only been watching it for about 7 years. And at the time, I was mainly watching movies and shows on Netflix and that sort of thing. And I've just slowly shifted more away from Hollywood and more to anime. And at this point, I would say probably 80% of what I watch and almost everything that I read is anime, light novels, manga, webtoons, whatever. So I'm just gonna go through a list of the reasons that I think this is happening. Like and subscribe and all that shit. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is respect for canon, lore, and source material in general. This is probably one of the most frustrating things about Hollywood for me. I would say an overwhelming majority of the time, anime sticks to the source material. And the worst that you'll see is something like Shield Hero Season 2 or Classroom of the Elite, where they just don't have enough time to tell the entire story. So they have to make decisions on what to cut and what to keep. And, it's not great. Obviously, you'd like to see everything adapted, but they don't drastically alter things, or at least not intentionally. Usually the characters are pretty much the same. They try to get all the big plot points. They don't really break off from the central parts of the story. It's usually the side stuff that gets cut, or like the world building, for instance, in Don Machi. And in Hollywood, it's like every year, how many franchises that people like are just getting trampled on and destroyed. We're 1 month into 2023. I mean, a franchise which I didn't even think could get ruined, Scooby Doo, is just being shit all over by this Velma show. And I'll just go ahead and say I've only watched clips of it. It looks insufferable. And the last few years, just off the top of my head, we've had Star Wars, Halo, Terminator, Predator, Lord of the Rings, the Marvel universe, the DC universe. All of these things are just imploding. And these people who are doing this are just untalented hacks who are using names for brand recognition to get people to get sucked in. And then they come out and just insult the fans because they made a terrible show where they don't give a fuck about the source material. And you see this repeatedly, even with Last of Us, which is doing pretty well so far, it sounds like. The people who created the show said they told the actors and actresses, don't play the game. This has been a common sentiment in the MCU, where the higher ups have come out and said to their actors and whoever, don't worry about reading the comics, stay away from that stuff, we're going to do our own thing. That they don't think it's good to hire people who know the lore that deeply. All this insane shit. You can find all that kind of meta coverage from Nerdrotic and Geeks and Gamers and those type of people who really go into it. And I'm sure there's a million more, but it's just ridiculous that they have all this source material. I mean, the first thing Disney did when they got the Star Wars universe was say, okay, the entire EU is not canon now, which is hundreds of books, and a lot of them which fans love. Instead they make a bad show where they just dump all over the source material, and they call the fans toxic for not liking it. And this is bled into video games too, to some extent, where we see things like Mass Effect Andromeda drastically changing from the original trilogy. Halo has just been a disaster. I liked Halo 4's campaign, but 5 and 6 were really rough. Or 5 and Infinite, I guess. Last of Us 2, people hated. And we're seeing this all the time where a Marvel movie comes out, a bunch of people say it's the best thing ever, it has a decent opening weekend, and then the box office just falls off a fucking cliff. And that's because they have a certain core fan base who will see anything Marvel, and then everyone else is like, this is bullshit. Because no one likes it, because they're just doing their own thing and they're not talented enough to. The second thing I want to talk about, which kind of ties into the first thing, is originality. And this is, I think, maybe the most obvious reason that Hollywood just sucks ass right now. And if you watch anime or whatever, even playing video games, you see the amount of like unique stories and worlds you get from, I mean, there's a million fucking shows. Attack on Titan, Don Machi, Odd Noah Zero, Certain Magical Index, Jujutsu Kaisen, Chainsaw Man. Even in rom-coms, there's one coming out soon called A Galaxy Next Door, where the main princess or the main chick is a princess from a shooting star. You have the entire isekai genre, and it just goes on and on and on. And they have no problems creating character after character that people like and find relatable. I mean, you see it on anime pages and Reddit and shit all the time. People arguing about who the best waifu of the season is, all that shit. And just at a glance for the upcoming year in movies, we have Ant-Man 3, Mission Impossible 7, which I love the Mission Impossible movies, but still. Transformers, I think we're on number 6 now. Guardians of the Galaxy, Aquaman 2, Indiana Jones 5, another Spider-Man movie. And if you look at the list yourself, it just goes on and on of sequels and remakes and reboots. Even stuff on streaming services, you're getting adaptations that are kind of failing, like The Witcher. And, we get some original things, like that movie Megan that came out recently. But that one was a horror movie with some success, and it's still in theater, and it's already been greenlit for sequels. So there's going to be 10 of them now. And if you get into spin-offs that I didn't even think could exist, you have shit like Willow, Velma, Witcher Blood Origins. I mean, it's just insane. And Hollywood right now is just dominated by superhero shit. Even though every once in a while we'll get a decent movie like Everything Everywhere All at Once, or The Northman, which I think lost money. And I think what we're kind of seeing here is that Hollywood has turned movies into what EA Sports does to video game franchises, where you have a really small indie game that just blows up, like Mass Effect. EA Sports takes it, mainstreams it, and just drains it until there's nothing left, and then moves on like fucking Locust. And that's what we're seeing from Hollywood. I mean, Star Wars, people were so excited for that to come back and get all kinds of new content, and everything we've gotten has been so bad. The sequel trilogy was a nightmare. Obi-Wan was horrendous. I didn't even bother watching Boba Fett because it looked terrible. The Mandalorian is very mediocre at best, and that's probably the best thing they've done, except for maybe Andor, which I haven't even watched. And a lot of people were saying it's the best Disney Star Wars, and no one's even watched it based on the viewership. So that's kind of the treatment that every franchise is getting right now. It's brutal, and I don't understand why Hollywood has no originality. It really shouldn't be that hard with all the people competing to be upcoming writers and directors to just put a little bit of money into some stuff and see what works. Essentially, you have like Christopher Nolan, Quentin Tarantino, a handful of directors and writers that people are like, okay, we trust you, do your thing, we'll give you the money you need. And they make good stuff in general. And then everything else is like, okay, what franchise has some side character that no one's heard of that we can make a series out of? It's just fucking miserable. I'm hoping that it ends soon, because I love going to the movies, and I haven't been in 8 months because there's just nothing coming out that looks even remotely decent, and certainly not worth going to spend $40-$50 on, after tickets and popcorn and shit. The third thing I want to talk about that I think anime and foreign stuff is doing better than Hollywood right now, and I don't know why this is like a crazy thing, but it's like just the main themes that are apparent from the characters in the show. In an anime, the most obvious one I would say is hard work and effort, and that also includes who do the people in universe aspire to be like. And this is something that I don't know why it's absent in Western media, but obviously if you watch anime, almost every single anime, they'll openly say, make sure you do your best, push yourself beyond what you think your limits are, blah blah blah. Like, that's a very common thing. I mean, if you watch shows like My Hero, Arifureta, bottom tier character Tomizaki, that's literally the premise of the show, is that he wasn't trying hard enough in his life, and he needs to put some effort in, and once he does, things go better for him. But it really is like every single one. Even in the shows that are just like normal high school shows, the people who are aspired to tend to be like student council president, who's academically the best and athletically one of the best, and they take care of themselves and they're good looking, and they're kind of the ones that are setting the standards for people in the world. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, we just get perpetual messaging of life isn't fair, but if it was fair, I'd be better than you. And you can see this in She-Hulk, where they always slip in really subtle lines about white male privilege and blah blah blah. No one gives a fuck. They openly have that line in the Batman and Defenders, and they just kind of blame white men for everything. It's fucking crazy. And if you go into comics and shit, you see all these weird self inserts, like that chick who made herself essentially the main character, and she's like a fat goth girl who's the daughter of a superhero. It's just nonsense. And I don't like getting into this stuff too much because you kind of have to dabble in the culture war shit and political stuff. But obviously a lot of people cover this. And you can see how the writers and higher ups for these shows will just openly say that's the message of the show is whatever, patriarchy and toxic masculinity, and insert a million buzzwords, whatever. People making the movie Eternals were bragging about the diversity and how there's a gay couple and saying that they saved lives by making their movie. And these people are just so up their own fucking ass. But anyway, the people who are looked to an anime and just in foreign media, at least, tend to be the strongest and most successful people, while they're kind of condemned in our media now. So the next thing I want to talk about is main characters having to suffer for their success, which again kind of ties into the hard work thing. Pretty much across the board, anime does this. And, the reason it's important is because the character suffering in the beginning and being the underdog is something that people can relate to. And that's kind of the enjoyment of seeing the character succeed, is that that they were once suffering. And they built themselves up after that instead of quitting or making excuses. And this is what makes them relatable. And you can almost always count on the first couple episodes of anime being a huge downer. And then that's, your character gets completely burned down before he gets built back up again. And, pick a show, right? Blue Exorcist, Attack on Titan, Solo Leveling, Lookism, Jobless Reincarnation, Demon Slayer, blah, blah, blah. And meanwhile, we're getting people like fucking Rey Skywalker, who learns about the Force and then uses it better than someone who's been mastering it their entire life. We get child Leia resisting Inquisitor Reva through the Force. She-Hulk is better at controlling her Hulk side in episode 1 than the Hulk is after however many movies he's been in, half a dozen at this point over the course of a decade. We get child prodigy geniuses who surpass all other geniuses like Shiri and Ironheart. Shang-Chi's sister teaches herself karate. Even stuff like Harry Potter, which obviously people in our age group all grew up on and loved. At the end of the day, he was just born great. Like, he lost his parents, which is obviously a terrible thing to happen, but then he was just deemed great after. So when he enters the wizarding world, his status is one of greatness. And it's just, I don't know, I don't understand why something that basic is lacking across the board in fucking media. It's really, really disappointing. And this one is a bit more subjective that I'm going to get into, but the way that relationships are dealt with in anime, at least, like anime rom-coms or dramas or whatever. I mean, even in shows that aren't rom-coms, usually there's still some kind of love interest or love story or whatever. You get the anomalies, right? Like Dr. Stone, but by and large, there's usually some kind of love interest there. And in general, I know there's a bunch of exceptions to this, but the relationships are slowly built up. And in a lot of them, sex isn't something that's had at all. Or if it is, it's not like some casual thing. And, you have stuff like where the characters already had sex in shows like Higehiro or Our Dating Story, The Experienced You and Inexperienced Me, which is coming out soon. The light novels have been pretty good, so I'm looking forward to it. But even then, the relationship between the main characters tends to be more about all the other components than just sex. And I don't really care if everyone's a virgin or anything like that, but I like that they focus on all the other parts of the relationship besides sex, because really it's a lot more relatable to real life. And in general, I think it just promotes a better message for people. I mean, sex shouldn't be dismissed as some casual thing. And obviously, in pretty much every Hollywood movie, it's like they don't know how to show that people like each other unless they show them having sex. And I'm sure some of that's a money thing, right? Like they're like, hey, we need to put some boobs on screen to get people in the theater. And maybe that's part of it. But to me, it seems like an inability to write it another way. And it could just be a cultural thing. I can't say for sure. But I like that in anime and, just in general, a lot of the characters' meaning to each other isn't just sex, it's everything else in life. So that's kind of a pretty subjective one, but I do think it's relevant when, Hollywood wants to moralize everything. The next thing I want to talk about is embracing biology. And this is, I guess, bordering on political for some fucking reason. But anime treats men and women very differently without dumping all over either sex. I don't think. And it seems like in almost every anime, there's all kinds of badass women and men. And it's really never made to be a huge deal either way. I mean, again, you can probably name a million off the top of your head. Railgun, Attack on Titan, Sword Art Online has a bunch. Skeleton Knight in Another World, 86 has a bunch of great women. Spy Family, Soul Eater. Again, there's a fucking million. And, not only are these women really powerful with their abilities in world in a way that makes sense, they're not 50-pound women just beating up men in normal life, but they tend to also still be pretty feminine. Like they look like women and still have women behavior. They just happen to be, or feminine behavior. They just happen to be badasses on top of it. And, you have some who use their female charms to be more like your femme fatale types, something like Cowboy Bebop with Faye, or, the villain in Shield Hero, or one of the villains in Shield Hero, right, takes advantage of the main character in the first episode, using her sexuality to manipulate him. And meanwhile, we're getting women who are essentially just trying to be men. I mean, if you look at a lot of female casting right now, you're getting a lot of, really androgynous men and women, but especially the women, they're trying to tone down how attractive they are, as if it's a bad thing. I mean, Rings of Power comes to mind for recent things. You have chick in Last Jedi who they made look super like frumpy, even though she's pretty cute in real life. I don't really get it. I don't understand what this desire is. They're making Black Widow cover up because Scarlett Johansson, after she made $100 million, decided she didn't want to be known for being hot, conveniently, now that she's getting older on top of it. And to be fair, some movies in Hollywood do make this attempt. You have Hunger Games, where Katniss sticks to distance fighting and archery. You have a pretty good movie on Netflix that I haven't really heard anybody talk about lately called Kate that came out. It's a pretty fun movie where she's an assassin and she's not just overpowering people and beating the shit out of them. She's just using skill and weapons and stuff to beat them. And like I just mentioned Black Widow. In the early movies, she does manipulate men. Like the first couple of Iron Man movies, she's using her sexuality essentially to take advantage of stupid men. And then the weird attempts that we do get now for women to be interested, I guess, in feminine things, if you want to say it that way. We have things like Doctor Strange 2 with Wanda, where she's going crazy and willing to kill infinite universes of people to have kids that she created from magic. Not sure what you're supposed to make of that, but there you go, I guess. Anyway, yeah, I don't understand what's so crazy about just embracing just kind of basic reality. Like men like attractive women. Women like attractive men. I mean, look at the casting that we're getting right now for superheroes. You have guys like fucking Chris Hemsworth. 99.9% of normal guys don't look like that. Everyone understands that women like men like that. It's not some crazy fucking thing, but Hollywood's trying to insist otherwise, I guess. So the next thing I want to talk about is giving villains motivation without trying to justify their motivation. And this is just a kind of a basic morality thing. Anime doesn't usually seem to have an issue with this, of making it clear why the villain's doing what they're doing and not making them seem like they're a good person for doing it or that they should be doing it. An obvious example would be something like Death Note. where Light is clearly the villain. You clearly understand why he's doing what he's doing, but he's the villain. Like, he's never portrayed as a good guy. Oh, kind of a random one for this that I'm going to reference is Mobuseka, or Trapped in a Dating Sim. And I'll keep it vague to not be spoilery, but the Principality of Phanos, which attacked him at the end of the first season, you have the kidnapped Princess Hertrude. She believes that Holfort is in the wrong and attacks them based on essentially a propagandized version of history. So she's not being justified for invading a country. It's just an explanation of why she did what she did. Attack on Titan is a great example, obviously, because there's no clear good or bad in that one. 86 does a really good job of showing racism without preaching that it's bad. You can just watch the show and you understand that it's wrong. And it also, I think, gives a lot of layers to the people in San Mongolia, where you do have people that pushed back on it, and people who are just afraid, and people who are just assholes, and everything in between. I mean, I think it's a pretty realistic reflection of humanity without talking down to the audience. And again, I know there's exceptions to this in Western media too, where we have shows like Arcane, where Silco was a great villain, and you can understand why he did what he did, or antagonist maybe would be a better word for him. And then we get crazy ass Scarlet Witch, who I just mentioned, because she's framed as relatable or right when she's killed all kinds of people because she lost someone that she loved. And like, losing a loved one is something that everyone goes through at some point, presumably. You can't use that as an excuse to kill a shitload of people. And, you know, her taking the hostages in that small town and brainwashing them for weeks or months or however long it was in WandaVision, none of that even gets addressed. It's just like, oh yeah, she was upset, but she'll be back as a hero later, and we all fucking know it. And we're just supposed to forget that she, you know, made Black Bolt blow his fucking head off. And, you know, again, sticking to the MCU, we have Killmonger and Namor from the Black Panther movies, and they're supposed to be like these deep, relatable villains. And Killmonger is just fucking Black Hitler. Namor wants to kill the entire world. Like, these aren't fucking relatable, they're psychos. But they're framed as people who you should be able to relate to. And Hollywood has such a lack of basic understanding of morality that Wonder Woman 1984, Wonder Woman, who is the protagonist and hero of the movie, essentially rapes a guy because she replaces his soul with her dead lover and just has her way with him. And again, Falcon and Winter Soldier, there's a terrorist that Falcon defends in the end. I mean, I think you get the point. Hollywood just doesn't seem to understand just basic fucking morality. And they can't just have a villain who's evil. They have to make them sympathetic, which I really don't like. And I'm okay with even just, you know, if you have some kind of fictional monster that's evil because they're evil, like the goblins in Goblin Slayer. They're just essentially feral animals. But they don't do that either. It's always supposed to be some nuanced, oh, everybody's right type bullshit. So moving on to the next point, and this kind of ties into the villains, is I like that anime isn't afraid to give side characters essentially their own entire arcs, which is good and bad, I think. It can be bad if you really don't give a shit about the side character. But in general, it makes the world feel bigger and gives the characters meaning, so you care about them. And, you know, they're part of the story. Again, examples of this would be Don Machi, if you've been watching season 4. If you've read the books, they do it the entire time, but season 2 and 3 cut out of the show. Tokyo Ghoul is a great example of this, where you get away from Kaneki or Kaneki. It's probably Kaneki. Pretty frequently, and especially in Tokyo Ghoul Ray. My Hero Academia had the entire villain arc, and even this season we've had the last 3 or 4 episodes without Deku. Soul Leader bounces around between a bunch of different groups. Ara Ferretta bounces around between the main guy and his classmates. And again, there's main examples. Hollywood, especially in movies, I feel like you just get like a line here and there from a character, and then you're supposed to give a shit. I mean, you get stuff like Game of Thrones or Walking Dead, where you get these big casts and they, you know, go from all the different groups, and they really do a good job of fleshing everything out. But by and large, it sort of feels like they bring in side characters as like exposition pieces, and then they just remove them when they're not convenient to the story anymore. It seems to be kind of an ongoing issue where you don't really give a shit about anybody outside the main character, and even the main character is a stretch half the time because they don't have to fucking write anything. And the last thing I want to get into about where Hollywood is pushing people away and into anime and foreign media, which this might, I think this is probably the biggest reason in the meta, like why it's happening. But as far as the stories go, it doesn't necessarily have to be an issue, but it is. And it's politics. Again, I don't like to get into this shit because I try to just stick to the movies and shows themselves. Plenty of other YouTubers do a good job of covering all that shit. But anime in general, even if there's a political message, it's a part of the story to the point where it doesn't interfere or it doesn't feel preachy, at least. Again, I just mentioned 86. That's a great example of talking about racism without lecturing the audience. You know, you have things like Parasite, where the message is to take care of the environment. It's a bit on the nose, but it doesn't ruin the story. You have the webtoon and Netflix show Lookism. It's about how differently the main character gets treated purely because he's fat and ugly in one body and tall and good looking in the other. And I know that's not specifically a political message, but it's also tied into the story, so who really cares? And they do a ton with it, and the character development in that series is great. And you know, you have stuff like Steins Gate, which talks about trans people in a really interesting way, I think, where the one guy in the show is super feminine and wants to be a woman. And this is a minor spoiler, but Steins Gate's like 15 years old anyway. But one of the timelines, he actually is a woman, and he's much happier that way. But because of the way the world works, he needs him to go back and kind of accept himself in his male body. And it's a really important part of the story, and it's not shoving it down your throat that he's some kind of hero for being a feminine man or anything. It's just a good story, and he's an interesting character. And you know, the most annoying thing to me about this is not because of my own political views, but just that the stories and media are just being destroyed by politics. And it's hard for me to talk about when I try to stick to the movies because this usually dabbles in real life and the meta and what these people are saying outside the story. But a lot of these higher ups and creators just openly say things like calling the fans toxic and bigots and blah, 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 just because they don't like their political views. And I would say that they probably don't even understand why they disagree with their political views. And it just bleeds into the material. Well, it doesn't even bleed into the material. It is the material. I mean, Velma openly talks about Fred being a rich, privileged white guy. Again, the Batman, Catwoman talks about rich, white, privileged men. Even shows like The Boys that are decent overall, the politics are ridiculous. And they're pretty nakedly put front and center, where they just hate half the country. They routinely make people in the show who want to own guns look like fucking idiots. And in season 2, they have a literal Nazi repeating generic conservative talking points. Shows that are supposed to be based on real events, even on Netflix, like the Richard Jewell story or the Unabomber or Waco. All of them go out of their way to make law enforcement look like a bunch of bloodthirsty, power-hungry, corrupt pieces of shit from the top all the way to the bottom. In Ozark, a retarded kid walks into a Walmart and just walks out with a stack of guns, which is just not how fucking buying a gun works. I was considering buying a gun in Florida, and I think it was a week that I would have had to wait after the purchase to actually get it and run the background check and all that. So it's just so transparent and obscene. And they're not clever enough to integrate it into the story in a natural way. Again, The Boys, Glass Onion, Batman, all have people being radicalized, quote unquote, to the alt-right by some kind of YouTube or Twitch equivalent or memes. And I'm not going to keep going on this kind of shit, but it just takes away so much from the story. And you know, when they're blatantly spouting political talking points, and it's just really hard to want to support media or movies or TV when the writing sucks, the characters suck, the world building doesn't make any sense, and the people who are making it come out and say that they don't fucking like you. and they hate you for having an opinion that they don't understand. And that opinion could be anything. So, yeah, I think politics really is probably the underlying cause for a lot of this stuff. But the effects are what we had to deal with. I mean, if it was all political and the stories were good, I don't think anybody would give a shit. I really don't. So, yeah, I think that's it for me for this one. Obviously, Hollywood's doing everything in their fucking power to push people away. It'd be nice if they could get back to making good or at least fun movies. I mean, you know, the original Predator was a good fun movie. Obviously, you have movies like Alien and Terminator and T2. All these movies we don't have to go crazy with politics. Just tell a good story. I mean, Titanic was, you know, was the highest grossing movie forever until Avatar. And that they openly show discrimination between rich and poor. But no one gives a shit because the movie's good. Yeah, that's it for now. I think my next video, I do need to do a part 2 about stuff that bothers me about anime. Because there are a few things that kind of get on my nerves with it that I wish wouldn't happen so much. Or I might do one about quintessential quintuplets because the ending of that really pissed me off. And I just didn't think it made any sense from a writing perspective. So, alright, thanks. See ya.